The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the Jennings farmhouse, its white paint peeling in strips that fluttered in the soft summer breeze. I leaned against the worn porch railing, the wood warm under my palms, trying to steady the storm raging inside me. My name is Clara Jennings, and at 29 years old, I thought I'd grown used to disappointments. Life had thrown me plenty: failed job interviews, strained friendships, the constant tug-of-war between chasing my writing dreams and paying rent. But nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal I had just lived through. 6 months earlier, my world had shifted when Grandpa Walter passed away. He was the cornerstone of my childhood, the one person who always seemed to understand me. While my father, Richard, measured success in money and accolades, Grandpa measured it in kindness and effort. He had built his hardware store from nothing, turning it into a place where neighbors gathered as much for conversation as they did for nails or paint. For me, the store was a second home, a place where I stacked boxes as a kid, doodled in the margins of receipt pads, and listened to Grandpa's endless stream of stories. He was the first to read my early scribbles, and the only one who said without hesitation, "Clara, you have a gift. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." That belief had kept me afloat, even when my father scoffed at my ambitions, insisting writing was just a hobby. Grandpa's faith felt unshakable, a light in the darker corners of my life. And so, as I drove out from my small apartment in the city to the farmhouse that afternoon, I clung to the hope that his will might reflect some of that love, a small inheritance, a token, perhaps even just a keepsake that showed he hadn't forgotten me. When I walked in, the air was thick with tension and the faint smell of coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the burner. My mother, Margaret, sat rigidly in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes darting toward the floor whenever I glanced her way. My brother, David, already occupied the couch like a king on his throne. At 32, he was tall, sharp-jawed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the family hierarchy. His real estate ventures, flashy, risky, often teetering on the edge of collapse, were treated by my father as if they were the crown jewels of our legacy. My father, Richard Jennings, stood near the fireplace, a manila envelope in his hand. His posture was stiff, his expression unreadable, but there was a gleam in his eye that made my stomach tighten. "Let's get started," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike, as though we were about to negotiate a contract instead of honoring the man who had held us all together. I sat across from David, trying to ignore the smug smile tugging at his lips. He looked like someone who already knew the ending to a story no one else had read. Dad opened the envelope, pulled out the papers, and began to read. His tone was flat, almost rehearsed. "Your grandfather's estate, consisting of his savings, the hardware store, and this farmhouse, is to be divided between his grandchildren, Clara and David Jennings, in equal measure." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Relief surged through me. So quickly, my eyes burned with tears. I hadn't realized I was holding back. Grandpa hadn't forgotten me. He'd seen me. I glanced at David, whose smile faltered ever so slightly, and for once I felt like maybe, just maybe, things were fair. But then Dad's voice shifted. He cleared his throat, looked directly at me, and said, "There's been a change. Before he passed, your grandfather and I spoke at length. He agreed that it would be best for David to inherit everything, so he could continue the family legacy. That's what's written here now." The words hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened. My ears rang. "What?" I whispered, my voice thin and trembling. David leaned back in his seat, that infuriating smirk returning in full force. He didn't even look surprised, only satisfied, as though this was the outcome he had expected all along. I turned to my mother, searching for some sign of protest, some spark of outrage. But she lowered her gaze, her silence louder than any words. I forced myself to look back at my father. You're saying Grandpa wanted me to have nothing? Richard's face was hard, unyielding. David has the vision to grow what your grandfather built. He'll expand the business, make something of it. He hesitated, then waved his hand dismissively. You're creative, Clara. You don't need this. Your path is different. Creative. The word stung worse than if he'd called me useless. For years, I had poured myself into my writing, working odd jobs to stay afloat, chasing deadlines for freelance articles, scribbling stories late into the night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Grandpa had understood. He had encouraged me. But my father, he had reduced my passion, my very identity, to a dismissive afterthought. I wanted to scream, to demand proof, to shout that Grandpa would never have abandoned me. Instead, I stood on shaky legs, my throat closing around words that refused to form. I don't believe you, I finally choked out. David chuckled under his breath. Always so dramatic, Clara. You should be grateful. You don't have the burden of responsibility now. The urge to throw something at him was overwhelming, but my hands only clenched into fists at my sides. I looked at my father one last time, hoping for a crack in his expression, a hint of guilt. There was nothing, only cold certainty. I stumbled out of the house, my mother's silence chasing me like a shadow. By the time I reached my car, tears blurred the world into streaks of color. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, my heart pounding with betrayal so sharp it felt like I was being hollowed out from the inside. The drive back to the city passed in a blur. Neon lights smeared against the windshield as I replayed every memory of Grandpa in my mind. The way he'd slip me an extra cookie when I stocked shelves at the store. The nights he'd read my stories, his eyes sparkling with pride. The quiet conversations where he promised me over and over that I mattered just as much as David. Could he really have changed his mind? Had illness clouded his judgment? Or had my father twisted the truth to suit his own vision of legacy? The questions gnawed at me, offering no peace. That night, lying awake in my small apartment, I stared at the ceiling, my chest heavy with grief. For the first time in my life, I felt like my place in the family had been completely erased. And yet, somewhere beneath the ache, a flicker of defiance sparked. Grandpa had believed in me. He had trusted me. If my father and brother wanted to erase me from their version of the story, then I would write my own. I didn't know how yet, but I vowed that this betrayal wouldn't be the end. A week slipped by after the inheritance fiasco, though to me it felt like I had aged years in those few days. I threw myself into writing, not because inspiration struck, but because it was the only way to silence the thoughts that gnawed at me. My stories turned darker, filled with characters betrayed by the people they trusted most. Every line felt like a quiet scream on paper, a way to bleed out what words in real life could not. Still, no matter how hard I tried to bury myself in work, the sting of my father's decision clung to me. At night, I'd lie awake replaying his voice. You don't need this, Clara. Your path is different. He had spoken as if I were an afterthought, as if I were some fragile ornament that didn't belong in the sturdy framework of the Jennings legacy. One chilly Saturday afternoon, I sat hunched over a chipped wooden table in my favorite cafe, a cozy little spot tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. The smell of roasted coffee beans hung in the air, mingling with the murmur of conversation and the occasional clatter of porcelain cups. I stared at my notebook, words smudging under my restless hand, when I felt a presence beside me. Clara Jennings, a voice asked, gentle yet certain. I looked up. An older man stood there, perhaps in his early 60s, with silver hair curling around his ears and a weathered brown coat that looked as though it had traveled many roads. His eyes, calm, steady, kind, studied me with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. Yes, I said cautiously. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, my name written across the front in neat cursive. "This is for you," he said simply, placing it on the table. Before I could ask who he was or what this was about, he gave me a polite nod and turned to leave, slipping out of the cafe and into the busy street. I blinked, stunned. Around me, life carried on. The barista called out a latte order. A child giggled at a window display. Someone's phone buzzed nearby. But all I could see was that envelope lying before me, my name scrawled across it like a riddle. My hands trembled as I slid a finger under the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. Along with the letter was a small brass key, worn smooth from years of use. The note read, "Dear Clara, you don't know me, but I knew your grandfather well. He trusted me with something very important. This key opens safe deposit box 472 at First Community Bank. Your grandfather asked me to hold it until the time was right, and I believe that time is now. Trust your heart as he trusted you. Yours in confidence, Stephen Carter." My heart pounded. The name didn't ring any bells, but the way it was written, calm, deliberate, sent chills racing down my arms. A safe deposit box. Why would Grandpa entrust a stranger with something for me, instead of leaving it openly in the will? Unless he'd known my father might betray his true wishes. The thought made my stomach twist. I clutched the key, its cool edges digging into my palm, and tried to steady my breathing. Maybe this was a cruel joke. Maybe it was some mistake. But deep down, something whispered otherwise. Grandpa had always loved puzzles and surprises. He once organized a scavenger hunt around the entire hardware store for my 10th birthday, each clue hidden in jars of screws or behind shelves of paint cans. This felt like him. The following Monday, I drove to First Community Bank. My nerves buzzed so hard I had to grip the steering wheel to keep my hands steady. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the faint scent of floor polish filled the air. I approached the clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a crisp navy suit. I have a key to a safe deposit box," I said, my voice wavering as I slid it across the counter. She examined it, then nodded. "Box 472. Right this way." She led me through a heavy door into a quiet vault, its walls lined with metal drawers. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed in the silence. The clerk placed the box on a table in a small private room and left me alone. For a moment, I just stared at it. The box was unassuming, yet I felt as if it held the weight of my entire life inside. I slid the key into the lock, turned it, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, a stack of letters tied neatly with twine, and a small velvet pouch. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the journal first, running my fingers across the worn cover. Embossed on the front, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Clara, my storyteller." Tears blurred my vision as I opened it. The scent of aged paper and faint cologne rose to meet me, the same aftershave Grandpa had worn every day. His words filled the pages, written in his careful hand. It wasn't just a journal. It was his memoir, stories of his childhood, the struggles of building the store, his dreams for the family. And in the margins, little notes to me. "Clara, this is the story you'll tell one day. Don't forget, you've inherited more than you know." I pressed my forehead against the pages, sobbing quietly, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of love and grief. He hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't cast me aside. The letters came next. Each was addressed to me, dated within the last year of his life. His words were filled with encouragement, warnings about family conflicts, and gentle reminders of my worth. One line in particular stopped me cold. "Clara, Family may not always be fair, but your heart is your compass. Trust it, even when others betray you. My hands shook as I untied the velvet pouch. Inside was a delicate gold locket, engraved with a tiny sparrow, his nickname for me since childhood. Inside the locket was a small photo of us together in the store, both of us laughing, and a slip of paper with the words, "You're stronger than you know." I clutched it to my chest, my tears soaking through the velvet. This wasn't just an inheritance. This was proof of his love, his foresight, his faith in me. But it also raised new questions. Who exactly was Stephen Carter? Why had Grandpa trusted him over my father? And why now? Why had he chosen this moment to reveal everything? Over the next few days, I pored over the journal, reading every entry until the words felt etched into my bone. I learned things about Grandpa I'd never know: his quiet fears about Richard Narrowview, of success, his worry that David would waste what he had built, his hope that I would carry on the family spirit in my own way. One entry mentioned Stephen by name. "Stephen is true friend. He know what to do if Richard fails. Clara, I only pray she receives what I leave for her." The words made me shiver. Grandpa had known this day would come. He had prepared for it. Meanwhile, whispers about David's reckless business dealings grew louder. I overheard neighbors at the cafe grumbling about the hardware store being sold off, about how he cared more for flashy deals than the community that had supported us for decades. Part of me wanted to storm into the farmhouse and throw the journal and letters on the table, demanding justice. But another part heard Grandpa's voice in my head: "Your heart is your compass." For now, I held onto the journal like a lifeline, the locket against my chest as I wrote late into the night. Each word I typed felt like carrying his voice into the world, a way to keep his light burning despite the darkness my father and brother had cast over me. And though the pain of betrayal still throbbed, a new feeling stirred within me: Isolve. Grandpa had not abandoned me. He had armed me. The days that followed were a blur of reading and rereading Grandpa's journal. I carried it with me everywhere, tucked in my bag like a shield, opening it whenever I felt the sting of my father's words creep back in. Each entry was like a conversation with him across time, his voice steady and warm, guiding me through the fog of betrayal. But as much as the journal soothed me, it also lit a fire inside me. Grandpa had seen the storm coming. He had worried about Richard's favoritism toward David, about how his life's work might be squandered. He had trusted me with his heart, even if not his estate on paper. That truth strengthened me, but it also left me restless. I couldn't just hide in my apartment, clutching memories while my brother dismantled Grandpa's legacy. I needed answers. The call came on a gray evening, rain tapping against the window as I sat curled on the couch. When I answered, my mother's voice came through, hushed and trembling. "Clara, I need to tell you something." Her words spilled out in fragments, each one confirming what I had suspected. My father had pressured Grandpa into rewriting the will during his final months, insisting David was the only one who could handle the estate. Grandpa, weakened by illness and too tired to fight, had reluctantly agreed. "I think he regretted it," Mom whispered. "He wanted to make sure you were looked after. But your father, he wouldn't hear of it. I should have spoken up, but I was afraid. I'm so sorry." Her confession was both a wound and a balm. The betrayal hurt deeper, knowing my father had manipulated the man I loved most. But it was also proof I wasn't crazy. Grandpa hadn't abandoned me. "Thank you for telling me, Mom," I said softly. "But this isn't over." The next morning, I drove back to the farmhouse, the journal and letters in the passenger seat. My heart pounded as the old house came into view, looming against the dull winter sky. I parked, sat for a moment to steady myself, then walked inside without knocking. My father was at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, the newspaper spread before him. David leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up when I entered. "We need to talk," I said, setting the journal on the table with a decisive thud. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What is this about?" "You lied," I said, my voice shaking but strong. "You told me Grandpa wanted David to have everything. But this," I pushed the journal toward him, "this says otherwise." David snorted. "You're basing your accusations on an old diary? Please, Clara, Grandpa made the right choice. You'd never know what to do with the business." I ignored him, opening the journal to a page I had marked. My voice trembled as I read aloud. "I worry Richard sees only David's ambition, not Clara's heart. Legacy isn't about profits, it's about people. I trust Clara will carry that forward, even if others doubt her." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. My mother, who had appeared quietly in the doorway, covered her mouth with her hand. Richard's face paled, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "You manipulated him," I said, my voice rising now. "You pushed him to change his will, and then you stood there and told me it was what he wanted. But he didn't forget me. He left me this, his words, his love, his trust." For the first time, my father looked unsettled. His shoulders slumped slightly, and his eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read, guilt, maybe, or fear. David, on the other hand, rolled his eyes. "This is pathetic. You think a few sentimental scribbles are worth anything? The store is mine. The house is mine. End of discussion." I stood, pulling the locket from beneath my shirt and holding it up. "This isn't about money, David. It's about honoring who Grandpa really was. And you're proving him right. You care about yourself, not the legacy." He sneered but didn't answer. Instead, he shoved his phone in his pocket and stormed out, the slam of the door shaking the walls. Silence fell. My mother wiped at her tears, whispering, "I should have stopped this. I should have protected you." I touched her hand gently. "You're protecting me now." Richard, however, sat rigid, staring at the journal as if it were a ghost. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "I thought I was doing what was best. David, he seemed like the one who could carry on Walter's work." I shook my head. "You measured best by ambition, not by heart, and you hurt both me and Grandpa because of it." He didn't argue. He just lowered his gaze, his silence a crack in the armor he had always worn so tightly. Leaving the farmhouse, I felt lighter, though far from finished. The confrontation hadn't fixed anything, not legally, not financially, but it had shifted something in me. I was no longer invisible. My voice, backed by Grandpa's words, carried weight. I knew what I had to do next. I began talking to people in town, starting with those who had known Grandpa best. One by one, neighbors shared their stories. How he had extended credit when they couldn't afford tools, how he had stayed late to help them with projects, how his store was more than a business. It was a gathering place, a cornerstone of the community. It became clear that David's flashy plans to sell the store and pocket the cash were already sowing anger. The town didn't want a chain store replacing Walter's hardware. They wanted his legacy to live on. At the cafe one morning, I ran into Mrs. Carter, the elderly widow who used to bring pies to the store every Christmas. When I mentioned Stephen Carter's name, her eyes lit with recognition. "Stephen? Oh, yes, he and your grandfather were close as brothers. Served in the army together. He came by often in those last months, sat with Walter for hours." She scribbled an address on a scrap of paper and pressed it into my hand. That afternoon, I drove to the edge of town, where a small cottage sat tucked behind a row of pines. Stephen Carter answered the door himself, his kind eyes just as I remembered. "You've read the journal," he said quietly, as if no explanation were needed. I nodded. "Grandpa trusted you with the key." Why? He stepped aside, motioning me in. Because he knew your father might not honor his wishes. He wanted to be sure you got what mattered most. His story, his heart. He believed you'd know what to do with it. I swallowed hard, gratitude swelling in my chest. Thank you. You gave me back a piece of him. I thought I'd lost. Stephen shook his head gently. No, Clara. He never left you. He simply waited for you to find your way. Driving home, I clutched the locket and thought about the store. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything Grandpa believed in: fairness, kindness, community. I couldn't let David's greed erase that. So I began to plan. I launched a campaign through my blog, sharing excerpts from Grandpa's journal and stories from neighbors. People responded with an outpouring of love and support, donating to a fund aimed at buying back the store. It felt impossible, like trying to move a mountain. But with every comment, every donation, every story shared, I felt Grandpa's presence more strongly. And for the first time since his passing, I truly believed that his legacy could still be saved. The winter thawed slowly into spring, and with it, the town began to buzz with an energy I hadn't felt in years. My campaign to save Walter's Hardware had started as a desperate attempt to cling to Grandpa's memory, but it was quickly becoming something larger than myself. Each blog post I wrote, woven with pieces of his journal, stories from neighbors, and my own reflections, spread further than I ever imagined. People stopped me on the street to share memories. The time Grandpa helped fix a neighbor's roof after a storm, or how he once stayed late on Christmas Eve to make sure a single mother had what she needed to build her child's gift. His legacy wasn't in the bricks of the hardware store. It was in the lives he touched. And now, those lives were rallying. Donations trickled in first, then poured like rain. Local businesses pledged support. Retired workers volunteered their time. Even the high school shop class offered to help with repairs once we regained the store. But standing in my way was David. True to form, he had put the property on the market, confident a corporate chain would pay top dollar. His arrogance blinded him to the resistance growing all around him. When he caught wind of my campaign, he confronted me at the cafe one afternoon. "You're embarrassing yourself," he sneered, slamming a folded flyer down on my table. "This little charity project of yours won't stop real business." I looked him in the eye, steady now in ways I hadn't been before. "This isn't about business, David. It's about community. It's about Grandpa." He laughed bitterly. "Grandpa is gone. You need to accept that and move on." "No," I said firmly. "He's here, in every story, every person who loved him. And whether you like it or not, people are choosing that legacy over your greed." For once, he had no clever retort. He just grabbed his coffee and stormed out, leaving the flyer behind. A week later, the town hall overflowed with people for a public hearing on the sale. I sat in the front row, clutching the locket at my neck, my mother by my side. Richard sat across the aisle, his expression unreadable. David strutted in late, smirking as though the crowd was his audience. The mayor called for comments, and one by one, townspeople stood up. Mrs. Green, who ran the bakery, told how Grandpa once drove through a snowstorm to fix her oven before the holiday rush. Mr. Torres, a retired teacher, spoke about the way Grandpa hired teenagers for summer jobs, teaching them not just about tools, but about responsibility. Even children spoke, remembering the candy jar by the register that Grandpa never let go empty. Then it was my turn. My hands shook as I carried the journal to the podium, but as I opened it, Grandpa's words steadied me. "My grandfather built more than a store," I said, my voice echoing through the chamber. "He built a place where people felt seen, where kindness mattered more than profit. His dream wasn't about expansion or wealth. It was about people, and he trusted me to carry that forward." I read aloud one entry, the one that had carried me through the darkest nights. Legacy isn't measured by what we leave in our pockets, but by what we leave in hearts. Clara understands this. She always has. Silence followed, heavy but alive. Then applause rose, filling the hall like thunder. I looked at my father. His eyes were wet, though he quickly blinked it away. David stood next, his voice sharp. "You're all blinded by sentimentality. This store is old, failing, and worth more sold than saved. Progress requires sacrifice, and if you really respected Walter, you'd let his legacy evolve instead of clinging to the past." Boos and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The mayor tapped his gavel, calling for order. In the end, the decision wasn't David's to make alone. The bank, swayed by the overwhelming support and the funds our campaign had raised, agreed to halt the sale and consider transferring the deed into a community trust. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a foothold. That night, I returned to the farmhouse. The kitchen was dim, the smell of coffee lingering. Richard sat at the table, his hands folded. "You spoke well today," he said quietly. "Thank you," I replied, unsure where this was leading. He looked tired, older than I remembered. "I made mistakes, Clara. I thought protecting the estate meant controlling it. I thought David's ambition was strength. But today, I heard your grandfather in your words, and I realized how wrong I've been." Emotion swelled in my throat. For years, I had longed to hear something like this. "You don't have to fix the past, Dad, but you can help us build the future." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Tell me what I can do." It wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. Weeks turned into months. Together with volunteers, I worked to restore the store, scrubbing walls, polishing floors, repainting shelves. The day we reopened, sunlight streamed through the front windows, casting golden light across the aisles. The familiar scent of sawdust and oil returned, mingled with fresh paint and hope. We renamed it Walter's Legacy Hardware, not just as a store, but as a community hub. Alongside tools and supplies, we set up a corner for local artisans to sell their crafts, and a reading nook where children could sit with picture books while parents shopped. On Saturdays, we hosted workshops, everything from basic carpentry to storytelling nights, where I read passages from Grandpa's journal. The first time I stood in front of the crowd, reading his words, I felt him there beside me, not just in memory, but in spirit, in the laughter of the children, in the determination of neighbors rebuilding together, in the quiet pride shining in my father's eyes as he helped stock shelves. David, unable to accept the shift, eventually drifted away, chasing bigger deals in the city. Our relationship remained strained, but I no longer carried the weight of his approval. My compass was my own now. As for Stephen Carter, he came to the grand reopening, standing quietly at the back until I found him. I hugged him fiercely, whispering, "Thank you for everything." He smiled, his eyes twinkling. "I only kept a promise. The rest, Clara, you did yourself." That night, after the last customer left and the store lay quiet, I sat on the counter with the locket in my hands. The moonlight glowed through the windows, casting silver shadows across the shelves. I opened the locket, tracing the tiny sparrow with my fingertip. "Grandpa," I whispered, "we did it." I imagined his chuckle, his warm hand ruffling my hair, his voice saying, "You're stronger than you know." And for the first time since he passed, I didn't feel grief pressing on my chest. I felt peace, because legacy, I had learned, isn't something left in wills or bank accounts. It isn't measured by who inherits what. Legacy is a story, one we carry, one we live, one we pass on. And this story, Grandpa's story, was now mine to tell.